I have a story this morning. It's from a book by Janine Grossmeyer. It's a Unitarian Universalist storybook. And I read from it last week, or actually, I think Eric did. Eric did, of course, in that wonderful voice of his. This one is about Hosea Ballou, who was one of the harbingers of universalism in early American life. He lived from 1771 to 1852. Our Unitarian Universalist faith tradition of today was actually one time Unitarians and Universalists separate. We'll mention a bit about the merger in my sermon. Over 200 years ago, in a small house in a small town on the edge of a forest of very big trees in the state of New Hampshire, there lived a small boy. His name was Hosea Ballou. Hosea, just like other children, liked to learn and do new things. He was always asking questions about what and why and how. And just like other children, Hosea liked to play. He liked to play hide and seek with his 9 older brothers and sisters. He liked to play word games inside when it was rainy, and he liked to play tag outside when it was sunny. In the winter, he liked to jump into snowdrifts. In the summer, he liked to jump into the creek. And in the fall, he liked to jump into leaf piles. And in spring was Hosea's favorite season of all, because in the spring, it would rain and rain and rain, and then Hosea could jump into the mud. Hosea, just like other children, loved mud. He liked it when it was soft and squishy, and he liked it when it was thick and sticky. If it didn't rain quite enough, that wasn't a problem. Hosea would carry the water to the dirt and create glorious mud puddles, all of his own. He liked to poke sticks in puddles and see how deep the mud was. He liked to make mud pies and build mud dams. He liked to jump in puddles hard with both feet and make the muddy water splash really high so that the mud splattered all over his brothers and sisters' clothes. And he loved to step in puddles very slowly so that the mud oozed up a little bit at a time between his toes. Yes, Hosea loved mud. Now, you can imagine that not everybody in his family liked mud quite as much as Hosea did. His mother had died when he was not quite 2, so his older sisters took care of him. His sister, who did the laundry and scrubbed the family's dirty clothes in big wash tubs, didn't like having to scrub all that mud off of Hosea's clothes or off of everybody else's clothes either, after Hosea had stomped in a mud puddle extra hard. His other older sister, who kept the little children clean, didn't like having to scrub all that mud off of Hosea. And Hosea, just like other children, didn't like having baths either, especially when it meant he had to stand in a wash tub in front of the fire and have water dumped over his head. But his sisters loved him, so they took him home and washed him and dried him and made him clean. Then Hosea's sisters went to their father and said, "Father, please tell Hosea to stop playing in the mud." "Hosea," his father said very sternly, "you should not play in the mud." "Why?" asked Hosea, because just like other children, asking questions was another thing he loved to do. "Because," his father, who was one of the preachers in the Baptist church the family went to, "just as we try to live a good life to be kind to other people and to follow God's plan, we try to stay clean. Yes, Father, Hosea said. And he did. He did try to stay clean. But it wasn't easy. He stomped in mud puddles, still on purpose, and he stopped stomping in mud puddles on purpose. He stopped making enormous mud pies, but sometimes the mud was just there, like when he went to feed the chickens or gathered the eggs. He got muddy anyway. So whenever he got muddy doing his chores, his sisters who loved him took him home and washed him and dried him and made him all clean. But Hosea's sisters went to their father again and said, "Father, please tell Hosea to stop playing in the mud." Hosea said, "Hosea," his father said, even more sternly, "you must not play in the mud." "Yes, Father," Hosea said. But he was sad because he truly tried not to get muddy most of the time. He said, "Are you angry with me, Father?" "I'm disappointed in you, Hosea, and I'm a little angry with you." Hosea hung his head and kicked at the dirt with his toes, and then he dared to look up and just ask, "Do you still love me?" "Hosea," said his father, and his father didn't sound stern anymore. "I will always love you, Hosea, no matter what you do." "Even if I get muddy?" "Yes." "Even if I get really, really muddy?" "Yes." "Even if I get mud all the way up to my eyebrows, between my fingers and my toes and my hair?" "Even then," his father said with a smile. Then he added very stern again, "But remember, Hosea, you must stay clean." "I'll remember and I'll try," Hosea promised. And he did. He stayed clean most of the time anyway, because as he grew up, he stopped liking mud quite so much. But he still liked to ask questions about what and how and why. So there's a bit more to the story that tells a little bit more history about Hosea, but I'm going to stop here because the love here that I want to hold up, it is a parental love, but I think in life often we think of that parental love as unconditional, and in the sense of the idea of God being a parent, this idea in universalism of unconditional love and forgiveness is very central to the universalist part of our faith tradition. So a bit of a switch here. This photograph is quite iconic. It's from a collection from the Associated Press, pictures of the march from Selma to Montgomery and all of the activities surrounding it. It is significant in the history of our faith as well. Here, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. walks with his colleagues, Ralph Abernathy and Andrew Young. And behind the Orthodox Archbishop is the Reverend Dana Greeley, and he was the first president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. The year was 1965, and the UUA was just 4 years old. So that in 1961 is when the two religions of Unitarianism and Universalism came together as one faith tradition. So it's 1965. The Unitarian Universalist Association is quite young. And when Dr. King's call to action went out to the nation's clergy to join him in Selma, Alabama, that fateful month of March 1965, over 200 Unitarian Universalists responded, half of them Unitarian Universalist clergy. The scene here, as some of you may guess, is the processional on March 15th for the memorial service for Reverend James Reeb, who did not survive an evening attack by an assailant just days earlier. And we know too that a Unitarian Universalist layperson, Viola Liuzzo, was shot in her car after the march from Selma to Montgomery finally took place and concluded. She was ferrying activists between the two cities, taking people to the Montgomery airport, when she was pursued by a vehicle from which gunshots were fired, and she died of the injuries. They were the assailants were later identified as Klansmen. So what is not well known in this history is the long-standing connection between Dr. King and Unitarians and Universalists. When Dr. King was at Boston College in the 1950s working on his PhD, he and his wife would sometimes attend Arlington Street Church, where Dana Greeley served. And Dr. King considered the Reverend Homer Jack of the UUA a dear friend. Dr. King knew a bit about Unitarian and Universalist history, famously adapting the words of Theodore Parker, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." In fact, just 1 year after Bloody Sunday in Selma and the march to Montgomery, Dr. King was the Ware lecturer at what was the 6th Assembly of Unitarian Universalists. And I read his lecture and found him quoting Martin Buber on the sacred I-thou relationship, Paul Tillich on sin as separation, and from William Cullen Bryant, he quoted, "Truth crushed will rise again." So it felt very, reading it, he felt like a colleague to me. I was studied the same theologians, and of course in high school I fell in love with William Cullen Bryant, and I think that was a foreshadowing of things to come, but which wound up being much later in life. But anyway, to go on, the point is that Dr. King's 1966 lecture felt collegial, and his themes, I think, still resonate for me today. Dr. King did not promote his ideal of beloved community so much in this Ware lecture as he did in others, but he did point out the centrality of love to the work of justice. To me, it can be couched as a liberating love, grounded not in romantic or filial love, but in that larger love, which he would refer to as agape love. And he said that kind of love does not just begin by discriminating between worthy and unworthy people. It begins by loving others for their sakes and makes no distinction between a friend and enemy. It is directed, he said, toward both friend and enemy. Agape is love seeking to preserve and create community. Preserve and create community. A love that seeks to preserve and create community. So we might say that the love that Dr. King described as agape is a universal love. a universal love that calls us to be concerned for our neighbors, our brothers and our sisters. Indeed, today, our seventh principle is concerned with the well-being of not only our neighbors, our fellow human beings, but the whole biosphere. This universal love acting in the world would, as Dr. King phrased it, be maladjusted to segregation and the suffering that it caused. Now, Ron Roth and I had a conversation earlier this week. I was trying to articulate this almost transcendent love. Is it okay if I quote you? I
Depends on what you're quoting.
meant to ask you before this. No, it's good. It was exactly what I was thinking. Primordial connectivity. I mean, connectivity at a very primal level. And I remember that reminded me that I had a very real experience of that kind of connectivity as a layperson in my Unitarian Universalist congregation in Marietta, Georgia. I was sitting in a back pew one Sunday after the service, waiting for my daughters and other grade schoolers as they rehearsed with our choir director for an upcoming program. Other parents were scattered about the sanctuary. The kids were chattering with kinetic energy. And I had this moment. It was like a time out of time in which I felt a deep sense of connection, of being an integral part of that scene, not wholly discrete in my being, but being connected to the whole of everything that was going on. It was like I had an experience of everything in that sanctuary all happening at the same time. And with that came a deep, warm sense of love and gratitude for the experience of it, for everything, for the misbehaving kids, the moldy pew cushions, the leaky roof, the budget deficits, the fractious parishioners, all the beauty and imperfections of beloved community. In that moment, I felt like I would have laid down my life for that little yellow church on the hill and everyone in it. Ron and I came to the conclusion that in congregational life, our love for each other must always be greater than our differences. This is the love that comes out of our Universalist tradition, and Dr. King called it beloved community. Now, Dr. King would not propose having been the first to name this kind of love and community. He too read Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was a German Lutheran pastor and theologian who died at the hands of Nazis in 1945. He was short-lived but prolific and courageous in his standing against the ideals of the Nazis at that time. He left a lot of writing behind, and he wrote, "The person who loves their dream of community will destroy community, but the person who loves those around them will create community." Bonhoeffer states bluntly, I think, the cause of the Holocaust, a community too narrowly defined and lacking in universal love. Yet the love that creates community, that seeks the good of the whole, is by no means an easy love to live into. So I am not suggesting that we all be happy, happy, joy, joy, right? It's work. It's work to be in community with one another. mean, Dr. King says we have to love our enemies. Have you ever even thought about that? Really? That's hard. It requires our humility and patience. It requires us to live with difference, to live with diversity, to live in discomfort from time to time. It requires us to listen deeply and share deeply in order to understand one another. Because building beloved community isn't about agreement or like-mindedness. It isn't about each other's comfort. It isn't about being a refuge from the outside world. Building beloved community requires us to have the widest vision of community that we can imagine. Dr. King never meant for beloved community to be a utopia. The love that seeks to create it is relational and concerned with the whole. Now here's another point of view from Henry Nouwen, a priest and a well-respected theologian who spent the sunset of his career serving a community center for highly disabled individuals. They required much hands-on care, work that can have its moments of joy, but which goes mostly unappreciated. And Nouwen said out of that experience, he learned that, quote, community is the place where the person you least want to live with always lives. That person is always in your community somewhere in the eyes of others, or in the eyes of others, you might be that person. Whoa, wait. How could I possibly be that person, right? But the truth is, we've all been that person at one time or another in our lives. And this speaks to the reality that any community of people will never be idyllic. And Henry Nouwen points to the fact that it takes a great deal of intent and hard work to bring about beloved community among ourselves. Yet Nouwen's description also holds out the hope that keeping the goal of beloved community in front of us will bring about the actualizing practice of awareness, forgiveness, accountability, and better relationship with self and others. So much of what Nouwen speaks to in terms of smaller circles of community echoes with Dr. King's vision for global beloved community. On any scale, in any sphere, it requires the practice of universal love, which means loving your least favorite person and always seeking to preserve a just community for all. So that brings me to what love requires of us, what it requires for each other to love each other, for that love for each other to be greater than our differences. And where we draw our circles of communities wider beyond our walls, in our relationship with our neighbors, that primordial connecting love calls us to be arm in arm with those who, at a minimum, need us to listen and understand when they suffer from conditions they have little power to change on their own. And at most, we go and actually walk with them, as 200 Unitarian Universalists did in 1965, when Dr. King issued his call for help. Once again, 200 people out of probably over, at that time, maybe 10,000 Unitarian Universalists. So that's not everybody, right? Activism is not for everybody. But for those that do, those folks At that time, they didn't have a well-vetted articulation of their faith. There was no 7 principles, no Article 2 proposal. All they had was a sense of universal love that was maladjusted to the suffering of their neighbors. Now, I conclude, again, not everyone is required to be an activist, but that's what healing justice within our fellowship is about. As part of the group's work, Jim Smith, who's sitting there on the end of the back row, next to the window there, in the choir, in the chalice choir, he asked Pastor Ron Brown of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Pearl City how healing justice could be a good ally. And Pastor Brown replied, "Walk arm in arm with us as we try to make life better for the people in Pearl City." And that's what is on the healing justice agenda. The areas for concern are housing, education, and healthcare. Jim has been in arm with Angela McDonald, attending the Boca Raton Housing Authority meetings to monitor what's going on with Dixie Manor, which needs to be demolished. But it's the only affordable housing for low-income earners in this city. And Jim reports it appears to be going well, as plans are about to be finalized to demolish 95 units and rebuild 200 units on the same property, correct? And it's expected to be completed in 2026. Sometimes it takes the presence of the community at these public meetings, like city council meetings, county council meetings. Sometimes you need to show up and be there and say, "I'm holding you accountable, civic leader, to make sure that you are serving your constituency in a fair and balanced manner." That's basically what Peace does on a much larger level in the county. Peace is a community organizer of which we are a member. So Pastor Brown will be here on Saturday, February 28th, to talk about education issues in his community. And in a few moments, Deborah Weiss will talk to us about her nutrition project and work with children attending the Lois Martin Community Center in Dixie Manor. I was there on Friday to attend an award ceremony, and I look forward to her presentation. Why don't you come on up, Deborah?
January 27th.
Oh, I think in terms of Sundays. It's Saturday, January 27th that Pastor Brown will be here. All right. So we'll conclude by saying that, oh, could we love soul to soul, unconditionally as God might in the Hosea Blue story. We don't all want to be and look alike, talk alike, even in as much as we on the outside might appear that way. Our lives, our individual experiences and perceptions and how we understand, how we know things is vastly different between people. And one of the challenges in congregational life is there's not often we don't often go more beyond coffee hour sharing with each other, right? And so, it's not, I'm not suggesting that we be like like an encounter group with each other either. But that there's a balance, or there's often something missing in congregational life, that we never get below the surface with one another. We never get to tell each other stories. So, inasmuch as human beings are challenged to give each other that kind of soul-to-soul love, until we get there, let all we do be guided by the love we have for one another that exceeds all of our differences. Thank you.